You checked the tracking page 4 minutes ago. Status in transit. Nothing new. You check it again now anyway. Thumb pulling down on the screen out of something that isn't quite a decision, more like a reflex. The same motion you'd use to check the weather or see if anyone texted you back. And the page reloads, and it still says in transit. And some very quiet part of you is disappointed, which is a strange thing to feel about a cardboard box you already know is on a truck somewhere. You know checking again isn't going to move the package faster. You check again anyway. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. This exact behavior, this precise loop, was documented in a lab with a lever and a very hungry pigeon, decades before anyone had a phone to refresh at all. Because that reflex isn't really about the package, the same way it isn't really about your email when you check it for the 9th time in an hour, or your last text when you keep glancing at your phone even though you know it hasn't buzzed. Refresh an app, refresh a page, refresh a feed, it's all the same small motion, and it's all running on the same underlying wiring. And the person who first mapped that wiring never touched a smartphone in his life. His name was B.F. Skinner, and starting in the 1930s at Harvard, he built a device that's since become famous enough to have its own nickname, the Skinner box. A small enclosed chamber with a lever inside and a pigeon or a rat on the other end of it. Press the lever, get a food pellet. Simple enough on its own. But Skinner didn't stop at simple, because he started changing the rules for when the pellet actually showed up. Some animals got a pellet every single time they pressed the lever, a fixed and totally predictable reward. Other animals got a pellet only sometimes, on no fixed pattern at all. Sometimes after 1 press, sometimes after 12, with absolutely no way to know which press would pay off. And the animals on the unpredictable schedule didn't just keep pressing the lever. They pressed it harder, more often, and for far longer than the animals getting a guaranteed reward every time. When Skinner stopped the food entirely, the fixed reward animals figured out fairly quickly that the deal had changed and gave up. The variable reward animals kept pressing the empty lever long after the food had stopped coming, in some cases for hours, refusing to accept that the pattern they were chasing simply wasn't there to be found anymore. Which, if you've ever refreshed a tracking page 11 times in a row for a package that hasn't moved in 2 days, might sound uncomfortably specific. Skinner gave these different patterns formal names, because behaviorists, it turns out, love nothing more than a good taxonomy. A reward delivered after a fixed number of presses is a fixed ratio schedule. A reward delivered after a fixed amount of time is a fixed interval schedule. But the two versions that mattered most for everything that came afterward were the variable ratio schedule, where the number of presses needed keeps changing unpredictably, and the variable interval schedule, where the timing keeps changing unpredictably instead. Slot machines, it's worth knowing now and remembering later, run almost entirely on variable ratio schedules. Refreshing a feed to see if new content has appeared runs almost entirely on a variable interval one. Different math, same lever, same brain on the other end of it, not being able to tell the difference. What Skinner's research doesn't fully explain, and it's worth sitting with this gap honestly, is why humans in particular seem so willing to apply this exact mechanism to things that aren't even physical rewards at all. A small red number on an app icon, a notification with no actual content yet, the mere possibility that something changed. Skinner was working with food pellets and hungry animals. The answer to that gap wouldn't come from a behaviorist at all. It would come decades later, from a neuroscientist looking directly at what happens inside the brain during the moment just before a reward arrives, not after. That neuroscientist was Wolfram Schultz, working at Cambridge in the 1990s, and his research focused on dopamine, a neurotransmitter most people associate loosely with pleasure, but which turns out to be doing something far stranger and more specific. Schultz recorded activity from individual dopamine neurons in monkeys, while they learned that a specific cue predicted a reward, a squirt of juice arriving shortly after. What he found was that dopamine didn't spike most strongly when the juice actually arrived. It spiked most strongly during the anticipation, the gap between the cue and the reward, and even more strikingly, when the reward arrived unpredictably rather than on schedule. That anticipatory spike got larger and lasted longer. Your brain, it turns out, isn't really built to reward you for getting things. It's built to reward you for the uncertain moment of maybe getting them, which means the ping isn't the point, and the coin never showing up isn't a failure of the system. It's frequently the entire mechanism working exactly as intended. Put Skinner's lever and Schultz's dopamine neurons side by side, and you get something bigger than either study on its own, something closer to a law of nature than a quirk of behavioral psychology, which is probably why slot machines got there first, commercially. Refining the same variable schedule into a business model worth billions, engineering near misses specifically because a symbol landing one space away from the jackpot triggers almost the same dopamine spike as an actual win. A trick already covered in enough detail elsewhere in this channel that it's worth just naming here rather than re-explaining, because slot machines were only ever the beginning of where this mechanism ended up living. Slot machine designers went further still, into a detail that rarely makes it into casual conversation about gambling. A researcher named Mike Dixon at the University of Guelph studied a specific feature of modern multi-line slot machines, where a player might bet $1 across 20 lines and win back 50 cents on one of them, an outcome that is, in plain arithmetic, a loss. And yet the machine celebrates it, with the same triumphant sound, the same flashing lights, the same visual language as an actual win, a phenomenon researchers now call losses disguised as wins. Dixon's studies using physiological measurements found that players' bodies responded to these disguised losses almost identically to how they responded to genuine wins. Arousal spiking, attention sharpening, despite the money in their account quietly going down. The machine wasn't lying about the math. It just made the math sound like something worth celebrating, which is not a bad description of what your phone does every time a small, mostly meaningless notification arrives with a satisfying little chime attached to it. The version that actually put this loop directly into your hand, the literal physical motion of pulling down to see if something new has arrived, has a specific inventor, which is more than you can say for almost anything else in this story. A developer named Lauren Brichter built the pull-to-refresh gesture in 2009 for an app called Tweety, a small, elegant solution to a real interface problem, letting you pull down on a list to check for new content instead of hunting for a refresh button. Twitter eventually acquired the app, and the gesture spread across nearly every major platform you use today, which makes Brichter, in a very literal sense, the person who invented the exact physical motion you performed at the start of this video. And Brichter has since said, publicly and more than once, that he regrets it, comparing the gesture directly to a slot machine, because once you understand how satisfying that small pull and release motion is on its own, separate from whatever content shows up afterward, you start to understand why it spread everywhere so fast. He built a solution to a design problem. The industry turned it into a lever. The red dot came from a similar place. Notification badges were originally meant to be simple, helpful reminders, a small visual flag telling you something needs attention, nothing more sinister than a sticky note. But red specifically is a color your visual system is wired to prioritize, the same reason it shows up on stop signs and warning labels. And once designers noticed that a small red circle could reliably pull your attention away from whatever you were doing, badges stopped being neutral reminders and became a deliberate trigger, engineered the same way that airline seat map you may have seen in a different video was engineered. Different industry, same understanding of what red does to a nervous system that hasn't changed much in the last 100,000 years. A former Google design ethicist named Tristan Harris eventually left the industry specifically to talk publicly about mechanics like this from the inside, helping start a movement called Time Well Spent, built entirely around the argument that these weren't accidental design choices at all, they were the product. An infinite scroll compounds all of it, because a feed that never technically ends removes the one thing that used to force a decision, a clear stopping point. There's no page 2 to consciously click toward. There's just more, always more, one more pull of the same lever Brichter built, dressed up as content instead of a food pellet. Streaming platforms found their own version of removing the stopping point entirely, because autoplay, the feature that starts the next episode before you've had a chance to decide whether you actually want it, quietly turns a deliberate choice into a default you have to actively interrupt. Netflix eventually added a feature explicitly checking whether you're still watching, a small on-screen prompt that shows up after enough consecutive episodes, which is a strange thing for a company to need to build. A feature whose entire purpose is confirming that a human is still present and conscious in front of the show it engineered specifically to make stopping the harder option. YouTube's autoplay countdown works on the identical principle in the opposite direction, a timer ticking down toward the next video unless you actively cancel it, turning the absence of a decision into the same outcome as an active yes. Not every version of this manipulation runs on the promise of a reward though, because some of the most effective ones run on the fear of losing something you didn't even want in the first place until it existed. Snapchat's Streaks feature counts the consecutive days two people have exchanged messages, displaying a small flame icon next to a number that climbs the longer you keep it alive, and lets that flame die permanently the moment either person misses a day. Millions of teenagers have reported feeling genuinely stressed about maintaining streaks with people they otherwise barely talk to, sending a message with no actual content just to keep a number from resetting to zero, which is loss aversion again, just aimed at a completely manufactured form of continuity that carries no real value except the value the app itself invented, and then threatened to take away. Duolingo built its entire retention strategy around a nearly identical streak counter, to the point where the app's mascot has become an internet-wide joke, specifically for the aggressive, borderline threatening notifications it sends when a streak is about to break. Neither feature is rewarding you for learning a language or maintaining a friendship. Both are rewarding you for not letting a number go back to zero. None of this happens in small doses either. Independent research tracking actual phone usage, not self-reported guesses, has repeatedly put the average number of daily phone unlocks somewhere well over 100, meaning the loop this entire video has been describing isn't an occasional lapse. It's closer to the default rhythm of an ordinary day for most people carrying a smartphone. This eventually became serious enough to draw the kind of attention you'd expect, first from public health officials rather than regulators. In 2023, the United States Surgeon General issued a formal advisory specifically on social media and youth mental health, an unusually direct statement from the country's top public health official, warning that platforms designed around exactly these mechanics, variable reward, infinite scroll, notification urgency, may be contributing meaningfully to rising rates of anxiety and depression among adolescents, and calling for both industry design changes and greater research funding to understand the scope of the harm. That same year, a large coalition of state attorneys general in the United States filed lawsuits against Meta, the company behind Instagram and Facebook, alleging that the platforms were deliberately designed using these mechanisms specifically to maximize engagement among young users, allegedly at real cost to their mental health. Multiple school districts separately filed their own lawsuits on similar grounds, arguing the design choices weren't incidental byproducts of building a social platform, but calculated decisions made with an understanding of exactly how variable reward and infinite scroll affect a still developing brain. These cases are still working their way through the courts as of this recording, which makes this less a settled piece of history and more a live argument happening in real time about who's responsible for a lever this effective. Here's the part that's genuinely hard to sit with. B.F. Skinner's research isn't obscure or hidden away in some inaccessible archive. It's been standard material in introductory psychology courses for more than 70 years, taught to millions of students, many of whom went on to work at the exact companies now being sued over features that map almost perfectly onto his original findings. Schultz's dopamine research has been similarly foundational in neuroscience since the 1990s. Nobody needed to rediscover variable reinforcement in secret. An entire generation of people building the apps on your phone took a college course on precisely why this mechanism works, and built it anyway, at a scale Skinner's small Harvard lab could never have produced on its own. The industry's response to the backlash, when it finally came, is its own small, strange footnote. In 2018, both Apple and Google introduced dedicated tools, screen time and digital well-being respectively, specifically designed to help you track and limit how much you use the very platforms and devices they build and profit from. Which means two of the largest technology companies in the world eventually had to build features to help people resist their own products, a bit like a casino installing a small clock on the wall after decades of deliberately removing them. So here's what you actually do with this. Turn off notification badges specifically, not the whole app, just the badge, because the small red number is the trigger doing most of the actual work, not the content underneath it. Turn off autoplay wherever you find it, on every streaming and video platform that offers the option, because removing the automatic default restores the one small moment of actual choice the feature was built to erase. If you're keeping a streak going with someone purely out of fear of losing the number rather than genuine desire to talk to them, let it break on purpose once. just to notice that nothing bad actually happens afterward. Batch your checking instead of leaving it to impulse. Phone, email, tracking pages, whatever it is, twice a day at set times, rather than any time your thumb feels the pull. And the next time you catch your hand moving toward that refresh icon before your brain has even finished forming the thought, say it out loud, just to yourself. Name it exactly for what it is. You're pulling the lever. Because somewhere between a pigeon in a box at Harvard, a monkey's dopamine neuron firing at Cambridge, and a phone in your hand tonight, someone figured out that uncertainty is more compelling than any guaranteed reward could ever be, and built an entire industry on top of that single fact. The package still isn't there yet. It wasn't there 4 minutes ago either, and your thumb is already moving toward the screen again, before you've even decided to let it.